Ladies and gentlemen, welcome the moderator of the next session, Alex Martin.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon in Europe and still good morning in the United States. My name is Alex Martin and I'm the head of GLOBSEC Brussels office, tuning in from Brussels. Welcome to this conversation on the US elections countdown. What does it mean for Europe? We are looking at the highly controversial presidential elections, and the global impact is something that we all try to give our 2 cents on. I'm joined today by Joe Pounder, CEO of the Bullpen Strategy Group, joining online from Washington, D.C., and Tori Taussig, Research Director for Project on Europe and the Transatlantic Relationship at Harvard Kennedy School, online from Boston. Before we start, I would like to remind the audience online and in person in Bratislava that you can ask questions in 3 ways. From the audience in the room, please raise your hand and you go to the microphone that is placed in the room once I invite you to do so. For those that are online joining us via the virtual platform into the chat, and those connecting via Zoom into the virtual studio, again through the chat function. Please keep your questions brief and specifically addressed to a speaker or the other. We only have 30 minutes to go through, and with this we will also wrap up the day. So without further ado, Joe, can you give us your account on the current situation less than 30 days before the US elections, following a first presidential debate that some pundits considered the worst in the history of these debates, and after President Donald Trump and his inner circle at the White House have been confirmed with COVID-19?
Yeah, well, thank you, Alex and Tori. Great to be with you, and thank you, everyone, for the opportunity. Boy, I tell you, I often thought there would be an October surprise to this election. I didn't know it would be within the first 2 days of October, and we still believe that we have several lifetimes to live in this election before November 3rd. I think if we step back for a moment and look, where do things stand? You know, if you look at the Real Clear Politics average this morning, you have at about 9.1 percentage point lead for Joe Biden. That's a pretty significant lead considering that he's at 51.3, which is above 50%, which is significant. And generally, if you were the Trump campaign, you would be hoping that that gap was not 9 points, but more like 5 points because of the inherent Republican edge in the Electoral College. So if it was less than 5 points, you stand a good chance of maybe losing the popular vote, but winning in the Electoral College. So definitely after the debate, and then after the COVID diagnosis for the president, we are seeing a little bit of a widening lead for Vice President Biden. So it is an uphill climb for the president. He's done it before. His numbers did hit a low in June and July during the COVID pandemic and the civil unrest that we saw in American cities. So he has rebounded. But I think as we look towards October and November, the president's going to need some better debate performances next time in Miami at the town hall, probably on October 15th. That's if he's well enough to do it. They're going to have to break through on some other messaging items. So there's definitely, I think, some challenges for the president. And definitely, I don't think they would want coronavirus to be the #1 issue right now, which is diagnosis brings to light. But, you know, I'll finish at this point. At this moment, I was in Berlin in 2016, the day after the Access Hollywood tape came out for the president. And I thought the election was over at that moment. So I do think we have several lifetimes to go before November 3rd.
Thank you, Joe, for this initial account. And Tori, I want to hear it from you as well. What is also the mood in the Democratic establishment with the recent polling data showing Joe Biden in the lead, and with this lead quite on the widening trend? And what type of strategies do you think the Democrats will continue to embrace in order to maintain this advantage?
Well, thank you very much, Alex, and good evening to everybody in Bratislava. I wish we could be there in person. I think Joe highlighted a lot of the important issues of the day that are affecting the upcoming presidential election, which is now less than 30 days out. As Joe highlighted, the polls do not look good for the president at the moment. I would also add one recent poll that came out yesterday from CNN, which conducted among likely voters showed Vice President Biden up 16 points nationally, 57 to 41%, which certainly does not look good for President Trump. As we all know, polling can be inaccurate, and at the end of the day, it will come down to electoral college numbers and what happens in swing states. And here, too, it does not look great for President Trump. Interestingly, I was looking at a poll that was released a few days ago that showed Vice President Biden, just as an example, up 49 to 41% in Arizona, which is an important swing state that also has not voted Democrat for a president since 1996. So across the board, especially since the last debate, things have not looked good for President Trump. And I think, as Alex, you highlighted, and as Joe reiterated, the most important issue on the table now is President Trump's positive test result for COVID-19. COVID-19 has not played well for the president's reelection opportunities. It takes the focus away from the message of a strong economy, a strong stock market that President Trump wants to portray. And, you know, as we saw the opening on the Supreme Court and the president's nomination of Amy Coney Barrett, it was clear that the president was trying to change the narrative once again away from COVID-19. And ironically, it looks like that nomination ceremony may have been the super spreader event. But again, the president's positive test result from COVID-19 shows that this issue will not go away and will remain a front page headline through the election. The election is still lifetimes away. 2020 has felt like a lifetime in itself. But I think on the Democrat side, Alex, to answer your question, a key strategy will be showing that we need to take this pandemic seriously. It is not going away. It was avoidable for the president to have a positive test result. He has not taken it seriously enough, and we will not be able to return economically as a strong country until this pandemic is managed effectively.
Thank you, Tori. There are over 7.4 million, if not wrong, according to Johns Hopkins University, the tracker, and over 210,000 casualties already in the United States. So, Joe, going back to you, you mentioned that there will be a need for more positive messaging and a better performance and a couple of other strategies for President Trump and the campaign to somehow rebound back. So how are the nominations to the Supreme Court or the current challenging debate with the House on the new stimulus bill playing into this new strategy, or maybe the rebouncing back strategy?
Yeah, so I think I'll step back for a moment and say, you know, what is the roadmap for President Trump going into November 3rd? I think there's a couple facets. One is definitely when it comes to coronavirus, you hope to see him do a little bit more of what he did back in the end of July and early August and re-engage on the topic and shift the messaging a little bit more to talk about it in personal terms, you know, now that he's gone through it himself, and talk about the actions that the administration took early on and throughout the pandemic. I think the second aspect is you do have the Supreme Court hearings, which are going to go forward starting in mid-October, and you want to highlight those hearings. You know, I think there is support growing for the nomination of Judge Barrett popularly with some polls that came out this morning. So you do want to use that as a springboard into talking about a more positive, assertive message for the administration and talking to your base Republican voters, because a little bit of what's happening now too is there's very few undecided voters right now in the election. It is a lot about base turnout, and the Supreme Court nomination will allow the president to talk to his base supporters across those battleground states. And then you hope a little bit with the GDP numbers that are going to come out at the end of October to pivot a little bit more into the economic messaging. I think if you talk to Republicans, even before the president's diagnosis, and talking to them about the Supreme Court, They thought it was a really good moment for the White House to be able to do a third Supreme Court justice. But they also realized they need to get back to his record and the economy towards the end of the election. So if you're Republicans going in on November 2nd and you're talking a little bit more about a successful Supreme Court nomination, vote, and confirmation, you're talking about the economy, you're mitigating some of the effects of coronavirus and so forth. That's the messaging dynamic where you want to be at the end of the day. And it's interesting about the stimulus negotiations. When they first broke down over the summer, polling was pretty clear that the American people were blaming both sides for the breakdown in negotiations, Republicans and Democrats alike. So we kind of think it will probably be a wash at the end of the day when it comes to why those talks broke down and their impact in the election.
Thanks a lot. I hope that folks on the Republican side in the United States also listen to your recommendations. And now that we have a bit of an idea what happens domestically, I do want to turn to foreign policy. And this is a key component for all of us residing in Europe, but also globally. And Tori, I want to get back to you and to ask you, how would you predict the transatlantic relationship would look like in case Joe Biden wins the November election? Will there be a change in the current narrative, but also in the policies per se? And will we go back to a 2016 type of transatlantic relationship or not? And if we need to adjust, where should we go, and what should we leave behind? What doesn't work at the moment?
There's a lot to unpack there. I would start by saying we should take a look back at the last 4 years of the Trump administration and its relationship with Europe. It has clearly been contentious. If you ask many transatlanticists on both sides of the Atlantic about the state of the transatlantic relationship, the foundations, the pillars, many would say that we are operating in a significant deficit of trust, which affects not only coordination on tactical policy issues, but also the broader relationship and how the US and Europe deal with shared challenges, from technology to China to climate change, the existential issue of our time. So if we look back, I think there's been a growing canvas of distrust here. And Vice President Biden has made it clear throughout his career in the Senate and as vice president, and also throughout the campaign, that he values America's traditional alliances and partnerships on the world stage. He's very strong against Russia. He's very strong on being pro-NATO and standing by America's commitment to Article 5, something that we've seen the president not able to do. And so I think from day one, you have someone in the White House who values its relationship with Europe and who is not going to look at Europe as a competitor and a quote-unquote foe in the way that the current administration has. When it comes to key challenges that the US and Europe will be focusing on in the years ahead, I would just highlight one for the time being, which is China. And that's going to be a #1 priority for both Washington and Brussels and key EU member states, regardless of who sits in the White House. There is strong bipartisan consensus in Washington for taking the China challenge seriously across aspects of the relationship, from trade and economics to political dynamics to countering China's authoritarian interference and influence. And so there's no doubt that a Biden administration in conjunction with Congress is going to take China seriously. What I do think you'll see as an important difference is looking at Europe as an important partner in taking on shared grievances toward China, particularly in the trade realm, and also on the multilateral front. I mean, we've seen time and time again the Trump administration pursue a very unilateral approach toward China, whether that be on trade or on other issues. And I think, again, you'd see early on kind of a hand outreach to European partners to work together on challenges, whether they be pushing back against Chinese human rights abuses, countering the export of surveillance technologies beyond China's shores, and also working within the WTO, again, as opposed to against the WTO, in pursuing shared cases against Chinese trade practices. And so just to wrap this up, I think, again, on this key issue of China, you're going to see an important shift from the Biden administration on how it views its relationships and partnerships in Europe, and also a stronger commitment to working within multilateral institutions rather than against them to deal with this fundamental foreign policy priority.
If I can pick up on the China issue, because this is a very crucial debate that we currently have in Europe, and China is defined both as a competitor, strategic partner, a strategic competitor, partner, and so on and so forth, working together on issues related to climate change and multilateral institutions. But in the same time, there is kind of an expectation, at least, that Europe will follow the lead of the United States when it comes to foreign policy goals abroad, and Europe at times feels that it's squeezed between taking sides or needing to choose between the US and China. Do you still think that it's realistic from the United States to hope in the current moment, 2020, after the last years, that Europe will just follow the lead and join the efforts without having that trust that you mentioned at the very beginning, that this is the way forward for the relationship?
Well, if there's going to be tensions between the U.S. and Europe, regardless of who wins the White House, I agree with you, Alex, that Europe is in a difficult position. First, it views its interests vis-a-vis China differently than Washington does. As you mentioned, it sees China as both a competitor and a partner. It looks at, especially important member states such as Germany, look at China through the lens of investment and trade, and the importance of the Chinese investment and trade a little bit more than Washington would. Europe is less likely to toe a hard line approach toward China. Top lines such as economic decoupling are never going to take hold within Europe. I think another important difference between the Trump administration approach toward China and Europe's approach toward China is kind of this ideological nationalist rhetoric that we've seen the Trump administration pursue toward China, whether it's referring to the coronavirus as the China virus, or some of the statements that Secretary of State Pompeo has made about countering Chinese authoritarianism in very stark ideological nationalist terms. I don't see that as something, as a broad-based strategy that Europe is going to get on board with. That being said, there are a number of shared grievances that Europe and the United States have when they look at their China policies. A lot of them are in the realm of trade and economic policy. I think there's also a shared values foundation in the realm of technology when it comes to pooling shared R&D and looking at innovation and sharing innovation policies between the U.S. and Europe that would boost Europe's competitive stance in new technologies and AI that it doesn't have right now. I don't think Europe wants to be in China's pocket when it comes to depending on Chinese technology. And so this is another area where we could see, again, a shared interest where if we had stronger foundations of trust, we could see more cooperation between the United States and Europe. But again, that's going to take a long time to rebuild. It's going to take hands outstretched on both sides of the Atlantic. And I do think with the Biden administration in the White House, you're more likely to see that olive branch, that hand reached out to Europe in ways that we have not seen the Trump administration pursue to date.
Joe, I want to get that question to you as well, because at one point, President Trump has named the European Union, if I quote well, a strategic adversary. So how, in your view, the transatlantic relationship will look like during the second Trump administration? There is a growing divide between the two sides, not only when it comes to NATO and burden sharing, but also, as Tori mentioned, technology, multilateral institutions, WTO, energy security, and so on and so forth. So what should we expect in case of a second Trump administration?
Yeah, so I might take a little bit broader, and I think with President Trump, a lot of what is past is prologue for him when it comes to foreign policy. So the issues that he emphasizes on the campaign trail are very important, and that way content is data for the future. So for example, in 2016, a lot of his European view was through the lens of NATO and burden sharing, and that has remained a talking point and a policy throughout the next 4 years. So the real question is, as you look at it from a European perspective, what are the foreign policy issues that he is really driving from the campaign trail, and where might there be a bipartisan consensus between both parties? What's getting in the campaign dialogue right now? differences between both parties on the Paris Climate Accord, on the Iran deal, on national security questions with Joe Biden about Osama bin Laden, the killing of Soleimani in January. These are the fundamental foreign policy issues that are being talked about. And I think they're significant to monitor because foreign policy is not a top 5 voting issue within the United States. So when both parties decide to engage on it, it's really important to tune in. I think what Tori was saying was right. You do have this fundamental difference of opinion between Donald Trump and Joe Biden on issues like the WHO, on NATO, on just the role of Europe in world affairs. But both parties have been highlighting those differences on those key multilateral accords. The interesting dynamic, though, is you are seeing that bipartisan consensus developing on the issue of China. It was an issue that, just talking to Republicans back during the spring, they thought they would be hammering Democrats on throughout the summer into the fall. But it was interesting, we had a debate in the Montana Senate race, which I'm sure you all watched live, but in the Montana Senate race where the Democrat was actually attacking the Republican incumbent for having past business ties with China. So we are seeing a little bit of a bipartisan consensus develop about the need to challenge China from both parties. It was interesting last week and noted here in DC that the House Armed Services Committee came out with a bipartisan report which talked at length about the idea that the Pentagon and Department of Defense cannot fall behind with China on the issue of artificial intelligence. And that was endorsed by members of both political parties. So yeah, while you do have some big fundamental foreign policy campaign differences between both sides, and the president is highlighting a few of them, which he'll continue to highlight should he win re-election for the next 4 years, you do see on the China issue more of a bipartisan consensus developing. I think that's where, in this new, more populist era that we're seeing in Washington, D.C., as opposed to maybe 2004 and 2008, the parties are developing a new middle, ultimately, and that affects every issue from global commerce, big tech, but also now China, where they're starting to find a new consensus, unlike maybe 10 years ago.
Thank you. I know that we have some questions in Bratislava in our Habsburg room. So if we could pass the floor to those who would like to ask now questions to our guests. Please keep the question very short and crisp. Introduce yourself and the organization you're representing.
Hello, my name is Dominic. I am from Maastricht University, and my question is a little bit of a hypothetical. So we know that Trump is sick and his health may or may not deteriorate. Suppose it does. And suppose that in one way or another, Mike Pence somehow becomes the president of the United States. I wanted to ask, how would his foreign policy be different or similar to Mr. Trump's? Thank you.
I assume this is a question for Joe.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. You know, before he was vice president, he was the governor of Indiana. He's the third highest ranking Republican in the House Republicans when they were in the minority back in 2009 and 2010. So not really much of an independent foreign policy profile from what I can gather, save for, I think you would see a lot of those continuations of the Trump policies when it comes to foreign policy. The difference, though, is he's quite a different character than President Trump. He's more conservative in his demeanor. I think he would be more focused on how to build a consensus around issues while maintaining a strong American viewpoint on foreign policy issues. So, you know, this is someone who has focused primarily on domestic issues for the last 10 to 15 years. And while he's been in the White House, he has been a pretty big stalwart of Trump policies going forward, whether they're on China, which he's been very vocal about, and he was vocal on during his time in the House, but also on issues like trade and so forth. So I would not expect, maybe outside of the demeanor and the approach to conducting in-person foreign policy, much of a change or a pivot should he become the president.
I don't know if Dora, if you would like to answer that, because I want to pick your brain on one of the reports that we just launched on the sidelines of GLOBSEC, the mega trends. And one of the mega trends that GLOBSEC produced says the American power is in decline. And this is one of the worry of the European counterparts, that US during the pandemic, but also before, was not to be seen when the crisis hit the neighborhoods, at least. So what would it take for the American leadership to bounce back, and for the America to be seen as that global power that everyone looks up to?
It's a great question, Alex. If I could just comment briefly on Dominic's question, only to add to what Joe has said, the way that the Trump administration has conducted foreign policy has been so centered around Trump's own personality and inclination to chime in on foreign policy issues over Twitter, shoot from the hip, go with his gut, go with his instincts, that I think has made U.S. foreign policy writ large appear, and in practice and in behavior, more chaotic than what we would see even under a possible Pence administration, even if there were to be continuation on policies. I mean, there have been so many times in the last few years where Trump's, again, jumping in at the 11th hour with a Twitter message that has derailed months of negotiations, wouldn't be a part of the foreign policy landscape. And so perhaps there would be a little bit more predictability, even if there were continuation on the policy front, just from a personality standpoint. Alex, to your point about your question about how to rebuild American leadership on the world stage, I mean, this, unfortunately, it's become a very political question. And I'll just give two illustrations of how I think American leadership has declined. One is through the hyper partisan and political gridlock that we see in Washington. I mean, we're incapable of passing an annual budget, let alone carrying out foreign policy issues in the last number of years, not just under Trump, but also under Obama. A lot of policies have had to be carried out by executive order because we can't get legislation passed through Congress. And so I think a government that's incapable of operating without this level of gridlock and hyper partisanship, and now this kind of really toxic elements of populism and polarization has truly diminished America's leadership abilities on the world stage. The second, and I don't want to make this a political statement, is declining influence, but also practice of American democratic institutions at home. I mean, attacks on the free press, pushing back on political opposition in ways that we're not used to seeing in American democracy, says nothing about America's practice of promoting American ideals and democracy abroad, but how we practice it here at home. And I think until we recommit to rebuilding from the ground up democratic institutions and norms and truly addressing where democratic discontent has come from within this country, we won't be able to be that light of democratic influence on the world stage.
Time is running short, and I think we have around 2 to 3 minutes, but I do have one question, and I will also ask you to put your final remarks into it. The question of European strategic autonomy kept on being one of the top subjects, but also not just in Europe, but also on the other side of the pond. And it's seen at times as an isolationist policy, or European Union trying to protect itself or put barriers in cooperation. Can you comment on that, on how the policies that are put in place by the EU are currently seen, or some of them are seen on the other side, and how can we make sure that there is no misunderstanding on what European autonomy means for the transatlantic relationship? Joe, maybe you would like to start?
Yeah, I might defer to Tori to chime in on that on the front end.
Sure. Well, I think, Alex, over the last few years, this idea of European strategic autonomy or some of the kind of independent defense policies that the EU has put forward, whether they be PESCO or the European Defense Fund, are met with kind of this knee-jerk negative reaction in Washington because they're seen, at least on the defense front, as counter to burden sharing and defense spending within NATO. I think if we take a step back and we look at the idea of European strategic autonomy as building European capabilities to be a strong partner with the United States, standing shoulder to shoulder with the United States, that we shouldn't have a knee-jerk negative reaction to terms like European strategic autonomy, as de Gaulleist as they might seem. And I think that's when we take a step back and we look at what this means for European political capabilities, economic capabilities, boosting European technological sovereignty, boosting European regulatory powers, whether that be on enhancing competition within the single market or on the technology front. I think that we can get to a point where this is more supported in Washington than it has been in the past. And I'll just close by saying that, again, strategic autonomy is not something that worries me as long as we're looking to enhance cooperation between the United States and Europe alongside boosting European capabilities. And I'll give two important issues that I think we need to focus on right away in enhancing cooperation. The immediate is economic recovery from the pandemic, where we've seen very little cooperation among both sides of the Atlantic until now. And the second is on the existential issue of climate change, where I think if you have a Biden administration, you have the shared goal of becoming climate neutral by 2050 on both sides of the Atlantic, and where you would see, again, an outstretched hand from Washington where we have not in the past.
Joe, last 30 seconds for you. If you were to advise governments in Europe, or particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, what should they know? 2-3 points critical. What should they know about the upcoming elections? What should they prepare for?
Yeah, so I think, one, you should prepare for a little bit more twists and turns in this race. It is a gap right now, but we still have 3 to 4 weeks. That is a lifetime in American politics. You know, incumbent presidents traditionally perform very badly in the first debate, so we always watch the second and the third debates. And remember, Republicans did not really even come home at the end of 2016 until the last 2 weeks for the president. So we have to, one, watch and wait for the next 3 weeks. Two, we all need to stay glued to our televisions and checking the results as they come in on Tuesday night on November 3rd. This could either be a very quick day or this could be a longer period of volatility depending upon what states are left counting their votes past November 3rd. So that's something that we really do need to watch. That's not a Republican or a Democrat issue, but just from the sake of conducting the vote, that's something where we do expect some volatility. And I think third, maybe I'll extend past the election and just say personnel is policy. So whether it's the president getting reelected or Joe Biden coming into office, I think everyone in D.C. will be highly attuned to who may be coming into the administration, who may be part of the transition team, and so forth. So I know when we work with strategic clients, that's what we will be watching a lot for those 2 and 3 months before the inauguration.
Thank you both for this short but very crisp conversation on the US elections. Thank you to our audience, both in Bratislava and globally. And for those of you in Bratislava, a few housekeeping notes. There will be a buffet dinner served on the ground floor since 7 p.m. And at 9 p.m., GLOBSEC awards ceremony begins for those of you who received an invitation. We have the awardees, Karel Schwarzenberg and Svitlana Tsikhanouskaya present. For tomorrow, we have a bit of a change in the program, and we start only at 9:45 a.m. Again, Tori, Joe, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts during the GLOBSEC 2020 Bratislava Forum, and see you all tomorrow.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.